Picture a football team so violent that opposing wide receivers dreaded lining up against them. A team that finished one season with 13 wins and only one loss. A team that then walked into the Super Bowl and beat their opponent by 18 points. That team was real. It was the 1976 Oakland Raiders, and for decades, football historians have called them the most complete team the sport has ever produced. But here is the question that starts real arguments in every sports bar and every comment section. If you took that exact roster, with the exact same coaches, and dropped them into today's NFL, would they still win? Would their brand of football even survive one season under today's rules? Stick with me, because the answer is more surprising than you think. To understand whether the 1976 Raiders could win today, you first need to understand why they were feared in the first place. This was not a team that simply won games. This was a team that intimidated opponents before the coin toss even happened. Their defense hit so hard that other teams changed their game plans just to avoid contact with certain players. Their offensive line did not just block defenders. It moved them backward, like a bulldozer clearing a construction site. Head coach John Madden, who later became one of the most famous broadcasters in American sports, ran a locker room built on trust instead of fear. He had almost no rules. He believed grown men did not need a curfew or a dress code. He needed them to show up on Sundays and dominate. In 1976, they did exactly that. Behind him stood Al Davis, the team's fierce and controversial owner. Davis built this roster piece by piece, chasing players other teams considered too old, too aggressive, or too unpredictable. He turned those rejects into champions. By the time the 1976 season began, Davis and Madden had built something dangerous. Nobody knew just how dangerous yet. For 3 straight years before 1976, the Raiders had reached the AFC Championship game, and for 3 straight years, they had lost. Twice, the team standing in their way was the Pittsburgh Steelers, a dynasty that seemed to have Oakland's number every time it mattered most. By 1976, that failure had become a heavy weight on the whole organization. Sports writers openly questioned whether the Raiders had the mental toughness to finish what they started. Fans wondered if this group of talented players was simply destined to fall just short, year after year, remembered forever as the team that almost made it. Ken Stabler, the team's left-handed quarterback, carried a piece of that pressure every single week. He was calm under chaos, almost lazy-looking in how he moved. Yet he somehow always found a way to deliver in the final minutes of a close game. His teammates called him Snake. By 1976, opposing defenses feared the fourth quarter more than any other part of the game, because that was when Stabler seemed to come alive. Nobody on that roster said it out loud, but everyone understood the stakes walking into the new season. Another year of falling short would not just be disappointing, it would define this entire era of Raiders football as failure. They needed more than a good season. They needed a season that finally silenced the doubt. The season opener could not have been scripted better if a movie writer had tried. Oakland hosted the 2-time defending Super Bowl champion Pittsburgh Steelers in Week 1. For most of the game, everything went wrong. The Raiders fell behind by 14 points with barely 5 minutes left, and the home crowd sat in stunned silence, watching their team's championship window seem to close before it even opened. Then something shifted. Oakland scored twice in those final minutes, clawing back into the game point by point. With 18 seconds left, kicker Fred Steinfurt split the uprights on a 21-yard field goal, and the Raiders stole a win that had no business being theirs. It became known as their comeback classic, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Do not let that dramatic finish fool you into thinking the season was smooth. Just 3 weeks later, the Raiders traveled to New England and suffered one of the most embarrassing losses in franchise history, falling apart in a 48-17 blowout. For a team trying to prove it belonged among the league's elite, this was a gut punch. Some analysts openly wondered if Oakland's fast start had simply been a fluke. Here is a detail almost nobody talks about. After that ugly loss, the Raiders had actually been outscored by their opponents on the season, 151 points to 148, despite owning a winning record. On paper, this did not look like a team on the verge of history. It looked like a team getting lucky. Then, everything changed. Something clicked after that New England defeat, and the Raiders became nearly unstoppable. They crushed the expansion Tampa Bay Buccaneers 49-16. They survived a nail-biting shootout against the Chicago Bears on the road. They closed the regular season by shutting out the San Diego Chargers completely, 24-0. By the time the final whistle blew, Oakland had finished 13-1, the best record in professional football. Running back Mark Van Egan quietly rushed for just over 1,000 yards. Wide receiver Cliff Branch led the league's receivers in touchdown catches and receiving yards, using pure speed to embarrass slower defensive backs all season long. Quarterback Ken Stabler put together the finest statistical season of his career, throwing more touchdown passes than any other quarterback in football that year, with a passer rating that towered above the league average. Yet when the league's official Most Valuable Player award was announced, it did not go to Stabler. It went to Burt Jones of the Baltimore Colts instead. Stabler's own peers around the league still recognized his brilliance, handing him a separate Player of the Year honor of his own. But that snub became one more small chip on the shoulder of a Raiders team that had built its entire identity around being underestimated. They had the record. They had the talent. Now they just needed to prove it when it mattered most. Every great team needs villains other teams love to hate, and the 1976 Raiders had plenty. Safeties Jack Tatum and George Atkinson built terrifying reputations as two of the hardest hitters in football, the kind of defenders who made receivers hear footsteps even when nobody was near them. Their physical styles sparked controversy around the league, with rival coaches openly complaining that Oakland's defense crossed the line between aggressive and dangerous. Then there was cornerback Willie Brown, one of the most experienced players on the entire roster, yet still one of the smartest defensive backs in the sport. His instincts had not slowed down one bit. He was about to prove that on the biggest stage of his career. On offense, wide receiver Fred Biletnikoff was not the fastest or flashiest target on the field. What made him dangerous was precision. He ran routes like a surgeon, always finding the exact soft spot in a defense at the exact right moment. Tight end Dave Casper gave Stabler another dangerous weapon in the middle of the field, a big body who could outmuscle linebackers for contested catches. Up front, the offensive line featured two future Hall of Famers in Art Shell and Gene Upshaw, a left-side combination so dominant that defensive coordinators sometimes avoided attacking that direction entirely. On defense, linebacker Ted Hendricks brought a rare mix of size and range that confused opposing offenses all season long. Even the rookies made history. First-year cornerback Mike Haynes stepped straight into the starting lineup and earned Defensive Rookie of the Year honors, an early sign of a Hall of Fame career still to come. By the end of the regular season, this roster quietly included 8 future Pro Football Hall of Famers, plus a Hall of Fame head coach and a Hall of Fame owner pulling the strings from above. This was not just a good team. This was one of the most talented rosters ever assembled in professional football. The playoffs were about to prove it. The road to the Super Bowl started with a rematch against the New England Patriots, the same team that had humiliated Oakland earlier that season. This time, New England came ready for revenge, building a fourth-quarter lead and pushing the Raiders to the edge of elimination. With time running out and Oakland facing a difficult third down, a controversial roughing the passer penalty against New England extended the Raiders' drive, a call that Patriots fans still argue about today. Oakland capitalized immediately. Stabler punched in the game-winning touchdown with just 14 seconds left on the clock. It was a gut-wrenching escape, the kind of win that leaves you wondering how much luck plays a role in every championship run. Next came the moment this entire season had been building toward. The Pittsburgh Steelers, the same team that had broken Oakland's heart in back-to-back championship games, stood in their way one more time. But this Pittsburgh team was not at full strength. They were missing 2 of their star running backs to injury. Oakland did not just beat the Steelers. They dismantled them, holding legendary quarterback Terry Bradshaw to a miserable day through the air and forcing a costly interception. The final score was 24-7. For the first time in franchise history, the Raiders were finally headed to the Super Bowl on their own terms, not as an underdog story, but as the most dominant team left standing. 3 years of playoff heartbreak had finally ended. Now they faced one final test, on the biggest stage professional football had to offer. Super Bowl the 11th took place on January 9, 1977, at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California. Waiting across the field stood the Minnesota Vikings, a team that had already lost 3 previous Super Bowls and desperately wanted to avoid a 4th heartbreak. From the opening minutes, it was clear this game belonged to Oakland. Stabler found Dave Casper wide open in the end zone on a perfectly designed play fake, putting the Raiders ahead before halftime. Biletnikoff quietly took over the game, catching 4 passes that were not flashy on paper, but nearly impossible to ignore in impact. 3 separate times, his precise route running set up Oakland touchdowns deep in Minnesota territory. He would later be named the game's most valuable player, though he himself said afterward that Stabler probably deserved the award just as much. By halftime, Oakland led 16-0, and the outcome already felt inevitable. In the second half, Minnesota tried desperately to climb back into the game. That is when Willie Brown delivered the signature moment of his entire career. He read quarterback Fran Tarkenton's eyes perfectly, stepped in front of a pass, and sprinted 75 yards down the sideline for a touchdown. The longest interception return in Super Bowl history at that time. The final score read 32-14. Oakland Raiders, Super Bowl champions for the very first time in franchise history. 3 years of playoff disappointment, one embarrassing regular season loss, and a lifetime of doubt from outside critics, all silenced in a single dominant performance. Years later, in a massive online fan vote covering the entire history of the NFL, more than 5 million votes were cast to crown the greatest team the league had ever seen. This exact roster won, beating the 2000 Baltimore Ravens by the narrowest of margins. That title still sparks debate today, but nobody debates how complete this roster truly was. And that brings us to the real question, the one this entire video has been building toward. Could this legendary roster survive, let alone dominate in the NFL of today? Here is where things get complicated. Football in 1976 and football today are almost two different sports wearing the same uniform. The rules have changed. The athletes have changed. The entire strategy of the game has changed. So before we hand the 1976 Raiders a trophy in an era they never played in, we need to look honestly at both sides of this argument. What would actually help them succeed today? And more importantly, what could destroy them before they ever got comfortable? The true answer is not as simple as most fans assume, and by the time we get there, you will understand exactly why this debate refuses to die more than 50 years later. Let's start with why this team could genuinely compete, even now. Talent evaluation does not expire. 8 future Hall of Famers do not become average players just because the calendar changes. Willie Brown's instincts, Ted Hendricks's versatility, and Gene Upshaw and Art Shell's dominance in the trenches would translate into almost any era of football, because elite football intelligence is timeless. Coaching matters just as much as talent, and John Madden was not simply a personality who later became famous behind a broadcast desk. He was one of the sharpest offensive minds of his generation, capable of adjusting game plans in real time and pulling the maximum effort out of his roster. A mind like that would study modern film, adapt modern schemes, and find ways to exploit today's defenses just as effectively as he exploited defenses in 1976. This team also thrived under pressure in a way that cannot be taught. They erased a 14-point deficit in the season opener. They survived a fourth-quarter collapse against New England in the playoffs. They dismantled their biggest rival in the AFC Championship game after 3 straight years of failure. Mental toughness like that does not depend on which decade you are playing in. Offensively, Ken Stabler's game would actually translate beautifully into today's NFL. He was accurate, mobile enough to extend plays, and thrived on getting the ball out quickly to playmakers like Branch, Biletnikoff, and Casper. That is exactly the kind of quick, rhythm-based passing attack that dominates modern football. Give Stabler today's rules protecting quarterbacks, and there is a real argument he becomes even more dangerous than he already was. On paper, physically, and mentally, this roster has every ingredient needed to compete with the best teams in the league right now. But here is where reality starts working against them, and it starts with a rule change that arrived within 2 years of their Super Bowl win. Before 1978, defensive backs could physically hit and disrupt receivers anywhere on the field, all the way until the ball was thrown. That physical, mauling style of pass defense was exactly how Oakland's secondary dominated opposing offenses. Then the league passed a new rule limiting contact to the first 5 yards past the line of scrimmage. Almost overnight, that style of bruising, all-day contact coverage became illegal. Passing numbers across the entire league exploded within a single season. The very foundation of how Oakland's defense operated would draw constant penalty flags in today's game, turning easy defensive stops into automatic first downs for the opposing offense. Quarterback protection rules have changed just as dramatically. Hits that were considered normal, hard-nosed football in 1976 now draw 15-yard penalties and even ejections. Oakland's defense built its entire identity around physical intimidation. In today's NFL, that identity would come with a price tag measured in penalty yards every single game. Then there is the pure speed and athleticism gap. Modern training methods, nutrition science, and year-round conditioning have created athletes who are simply faster and more explosive than what existed in 1976, even accounting for the genuine talent on Oakland's roster. Today's defensive backs run with modern receivers in ways that would have seemed superhuman 50 years ago. Cliff Branch's game-changing speed, so rare in his own era, would still be good, but it would no longer be the outlier weapon that broke games open on its own. Offensive schemes have evolved dramatically as well. Today's teams spread the field with multiple receivers, use constant pre-snap motion, and force defenses to defend the entire width of the field on nearly every play. Oakland's defense, built for a more physical, condensed style of football, would need real time to adjust to defending open space instead of simply overpowering blockers and receivers in tight formations. There is also a grind most fans never think about. The 1976 Raiders played a 14-game regular season. Today's teams play 17 games across an 18-week schedule, with a much longer injury list and a much deeper rotation of players cycling in and out all year. Surviving that extra grind, without the same recovery technology and sports science teams rely on today, would test even the most talented roster in football history. Depth matters just as much as star power in the modern game, and Oakland's era simply never demanded the same kind of roster depth teams need to survive a full modern season. There is also the business side of football to consider. In 1976, there was no real free agency and no salary cap forcing teams to break apart a championship roster. Al Davis could keep his core together year after year, almost however he wanted. Today, a hard salary cap forces even title-winning teams to lose key players nearly every offseason, no matter how badly a coach wants to keep them together. Even if the 1976 Raiders were transported into today's league with every ounce of their talent intact, the modern business of football would eventually pull that roster apart in a way 1970s football never did. None of this means the 1976 Raiders were not great. It means the sport itself shifted underneath teams exactly like them, on purpose, specifically because teams like them were considered too dominant to allow inside the existing rules. So, could the 1976 Oakland Raiders still win in today's NFL? The honest answer is this: their talent would translate. Their coaching would translate. Their mental toughness would translate. But their exact style of football, the mauling offensive line, the physically dominant secondary, the slower, more condensed formations of 1970s football, would need real adjustment before that talent could shine the way it did in 1976. Drop this roster into today's game with today's training, today's rules, and a full offseason to adjust, and there is a genuine argument they still compete for a championship. Drop them in exactly as they were, with zero adjustment period, and today's rules would punish their physical style before they ever found their rhythm. Maybe that is the real answer buried inside this entire debate. Great teams are not just great because of talent alone. They are great because of how perfectly they were built for their specific moment in football history. The 1976 Raiders were not just good enough to win in 1976. They were built, almost perfectly, to dominate that exact era of the sport, and in the end, that might be the most impressive thing about them. Not whether they could survive 50 years of rule changes and evolution, but that they never had to. They showed up, in their own era, against their own competition, and they proved beyond any argument that they were the best team in the world. Some legends do not need a time machine to prove their greatness. The 1976 Raiders already did.